Sponsored by the James Madison Council.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. I'm Robin Givhan, Senior Critic at Large for The Washington Post, and it is my pleasure to be here with Hawa Hassan, author of In Bibi's Kitchen, The Recipes and Stories of Grandmothers from 8 African Countries That Touch the Indian Ocean, along with Marcus Samuelsson, and he's the author of The Rise, Black Cooks and the Soul of American Food. Welcome. And before we get started, I just wanted to let the audience know that the last 10 minutes of this 30-minute live conversation will be dedicated to your questions. So please begin submitting them now. And we are off.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for having me.
I thought I would start.
And I lost the hat game even before the event started. So what now?
Well, I thought I would begin with the question of the festival. The theme is Open a Book, Open the World. And I was wondering how books have opened the world for you. And shall we start with Marcus?
I mean, books has always been game-changing for me on so many different moments. I remember being a kid and my father gave me Malcolm X, Alex Haley's Malcolm X. It was game-changing for me in terms of identity and understanding, you know, when I was becoming, you know, as a teenager, going from boy, eventually man. Then also cookbooks and the lack of Black cookbooks. I couldn't find them being in Europe, and it was pre-internet, so I was like, wow, my goal one day is to make cookbooks that for someone who looks like me can find books about our journey, about not one narrative, but multiple complex journeys about Black cooking. And so I've spent 20 years of my life creating books about our journeys.
And what about you, Hawa? How have books opened your world?
Well, I came to the US in the mid-90s, and I was in elementary school when I realized that not everyone spoke Somali or Swahili. And so books have taught me to speak English, they've taught me to read English, but one of the things that I've most learned from books is that I was so similar to so many people across the world. They've made my world smaller, they've expanded my horizon. And one of the very first books I remember reading at my own will was Yesterday I Cried by Yavanna. And that was the very first time I think I had a word for grief that was generational, that was women, that was from a mother's perspective. And so they've opened up a whole world to me and have made me feel seen and a part of a larger picture.
Well, you know, both of you have talked about the connective fiber in books, and both of your books really do aim to connect people who are from a multitude of countries and cultures. Marcus, in the very beginning of your book, you write that this is a cookbook about race, class, and the equity of the American food landscape. That's a lot on a plate.
But it can be delicious, and guess what? It's part of society. And the more we know about it, the better tools we have to be able to deal with it, right? When you can't talk about American cooking without really bringing in an African-American narrative and do it correctly and understand how linked it is to Africa and understand what the Caribbean and the Great Migration has done to it. And then you think about Jim Crow and class and equity in terms of the food world. You know, I think we have a long way to go. And through great storytelling, and I actually think this specific moment is one of the best times ever for Black cooking and Black hospitality, because there's so many multiple different ways of enter the game and tell stories. And it's not a coincidence, I think, why Black cooking and Black storytelling is thriving at this moment. I think it has a lot to do with the pandemic as well. You know, as people went in and started to cook more at home, they were intrigued by different stories and different type of storytelling. So I think it's a very special moment we're in terms of Black storytelling, in terms of food.
You know, it's interesting you use the phrase Black cooking and that it's used in the book as well. And you admit that defining Black cooking, you know, probably has a million different variations depending on who you ask. So I wanted to ask you, how do you define Black cooking? Because unlike, say, Italian cooking or French cooking, it's not rooted in necessarily one particular country.
Is this for me, Robin?
Oh, for Marcus.
Okay, good.
There you have also like our narratives, our journeys, right? Black cooking can be defined in Germany, it can be in Japan, it can be wherever, or it can be in Sweden, right? First of all, the history books, we committed so much time to the foods of Europe. So I think we are pretty well diverse in regional Italian cooking, but yet the whole continent of Africa is a mystery for most Americans when it comes to food. And it's so paradox because Africa is the oldest continent. You know, we have the oldest grains. We're the place where so much of modern cooking comes from. So I think it's our time now to tell multiple stories about how the food got to our country, how it's been tweaked, how it's going to get changed, because it is not one thing. Just like Black music is not one thing, Black food has many different doors, cultures, and narratives.
And how you focus on Bibi's kitchen, and that refers to grandmothers. And I was very curious, as you talk to women from the different African countries that touch the Indian Ocean, you ask them, about themselves, about what they're most proud of. You really shine a light on their stories. And I was wondering how much of sort of a feminist gesture, to some degree, your cookbook is.
I didn't go into it with trying to accomplish that. I think that that's what it evolved into. My intention was to really bring every piece of who I was into the book and to allow other people to do the same. So I like to say that the book is a collaboration of women that I grew up with, people whose feet I sat at. And then it's, stories of the continent from their perspectives. For me, you can't have cooking without talking about the people who've done the cooking always, and that's grandmothers. And so I didn't go into it trying to make it, strictly women and come at it from that perspective, but it just unfolded in that way.
And you asked them very specifically about what community means to them. Why was that an important question to dig into?
Well, again, if I'm talking about the story of Hawa Hassan, I think it's hard to share my story without talking about the people who took care of me. And those were strangers in Seattle. Those were African-American people that I'd never met, my basketball coaches, my Ethiopian best friends, Sudanese refugees. And so, I can always talk about what community means to me. And I think it's something that no matter where I am in the world, I develop for myself. And their advice and their conversation in regards to that was something I wanted to know more about as I grew older. And I thought that that's something the audience could have really benefited from.
As in the conversations, there's a real sense of intimacy. So I was curious about how you found all this incredible range of women.
Community. I grew up in Nairobi, and so a few of the Bibis in the Nairobi chapter and the Kenya chapter are friends, a family. I lived in Cape Town, so that's the woman that's in the book is my friend Faith's auntie. Same again here in Yonkers. That happens to be my friend Michael, who's from Everett, Washington's friend's mother. And so, community really played a big part in making this book come together. If you look at the acknowledgement, it's like 2 pages or something like that.
I mean, as much as Hawa's book really speaks to a kind of intimacy and family, Marcus, your book really elevates a lot of the professionals, the Black professionals in the industry. And several of them have studied in places like the Cordon Bleu and, at French Laundry. How far away are we now from a time when, there are these sort of rarefied institutions that celebrate Black cuisine and we have young chefs who are studying in those spaces? I mean, are we anywhere close to having a Cordon Bleu that focuses on Black cuisine?
Well, I think when we do it, because of our history, it's always different, right? I think, first of all, in most Black communities, we've had female entrepreneurship, women that have created these institutions, whether it's the Edna Lewis or the Sylvia Woods or Dookie Chase and Miss Chase in New Orleans, right? These were institutions that, Dookie's restaurant is over 80 years old. Sylvia's is 60 years old. So they provided jobs, sent kids to college, and protected and preserved a very specific African-American cuisine and importance in our communities. And it's important to elevate that and remember that, because that's an incredible foundation. And I think, when the conversation around fine dining, it's such a stigma around it, because there's the space that we weren't invited into for so many years, structurally, financially, access to building it on so many different levels. So, but I also, I talk a lot about who's got next, the next generation that's coming. And when I look at, in this country right now, we have something like the family reunion that Kwame put on. We have, the food festivals that I've been working on, Harlem Eat Up. There are, on TikTok, there's great entrepreneurship in the Black community where you can learn cooking and you can learn the trade and you can learn the craft through many different ways. So I think we're never going to have a linear path, and that's our strength in many different ways. But I do think that we are at we're a good space, good place, and because there's many different journeys that we're going to go. I look at Chef Michaels that is in the book. He has a cooking studio in Nigeria, Lagos. So why do our journey have to go through Paris? Why couldn't you go as your young chef to Lagos and learn from Chef Michael instead, right? So the book was there, so both we can honor and learn from the past, but also if you're a culinarian or a food writer, you want to see there's a big community around you and also connect, right? And that's really what the Rise provides. It becomes a space where you can connect.
I mean, in many ways, it sounds like a big part of what you're saying is that we have to reassess how we define fine dining. We need to reassess how we are thinking about, the education of chefs and what it means to really learn how to cook in an international and inclusive way. This question is for both of you. The question of ingredients, the question of access. In so many of the stories, the women talk about getting ingredients from their home country if they happen to have migrated elsewhere. And Marcus, I was struck by one of the recipes where I was instructed to ferment an egg yolk for 6 hours. And I thought, oh my God, I can't do that. I mean, how big is the hurdle for sort of the home cook in being able to really explore the recipes and be successful with them?
Well,
Either
first,
both.
yes, you can. Yes, you can do that because you don't have to stand and watch the fermentation. The great thing is that you wrap it and you go on and do other things. I mean, if you want a really good injera, you want to ferment the batter, right? That's the whole key to get really good. And fermentation is also amazing for your body, right? So we have to relearn that these processes might not always be built for the life that we're living right here and now, right? Or saying they are, and how do we have to relearn that, right? So if you want to make a great injera, you want to ferment it overnight. But guess what? You can make the batter, let it sit overnight, and in the morning it's ready. So, again, we programmed so much to learn from sort of this very specific European way of cooking where we had refrigeration and so on. A lot of African recipes are written from where refrigeration wasn't part of it, right? And so for me, it's like, why do we have to learn on fermentation when it comes from European place versus when it comes from an African place, right? So we can do that. And in terms of ingredients, you know that if you ever fly Ethiopian Airline or if you fly India Airline, we are sending things to our cousins. Could be clothes, could be money, could be books, could be medicine. But when we come back, we bring spices and ingredients back. I wouldn't even think about coming back from Ethiopia without injera, fermented butter, and berbere. That's just, everyone knows that.
Yeah.
And
I want to
Please speak.
piggyback off of what Chef Marcus said. I mean, when you talk about the home cook, you're talking about a group of people who've been encouraged to make foods like French cuisine, right? Or, even let's take a step closer to where we are, Korean cuisine. And we're talking about regional Korean cuisine. My thought of school is if you can build a global pantry, which is often just, just outside of salt and pepper, right? So a cumin, a cardamom, a cinnamon, a clove, a coriander. In a place like New York City, we're so lucky to have Shahadis and Kaluthians, but there's also online stores that are able to sell these things to you. So if you're able to build yourself a global pantry and arm yourself with the tools you need, there isn't much a home cook cannot accomplish, especially because of where we're at right now in terms of forward movement, as Chef Marcus mentioned. So, I don't know that it's African foods or Indian foods or this or that, but if you're willing to take on the responsibility of cooking these foods and getting to know about, the global maturity, it is really your duty to honor your pantry by stocking the right things in there.
And I also would say the earlier you cook this way, the better, because we are forced to cook this way, right? There's a major things happening, right? Climate change is completely changing how we have to cook. So we have to cook more plant-based. We have to take down our animal protein intake. And guess what? The majority of the world is way ahead of the US on that. So the quicker we retool, we cook more with chickpeas, lentils, and so on, I think the better. And a lot of these things require a little bit of fermentation, using spice as a preserving technique, and a flavor enhancer, of course, and just retooling how we learn how to enjoy a meal. It's not like, oh, this vegetarian meal was amazing, it tastes like chicken. That's not the goal. It should be, this meal is amazing because it is.
And I think also people might be surprised at just the sheer number of recipes that are vegetarian or vegan, that are just sort of inherently healthier, because that is sort of the lineage of the cuisine. Were there things that surprised you as you talked to the different women in your book, Hawa, as they talk about their favorite foods and their favorite recipes?
Not so much. I think, I come from a mother who lives in Norway. And my grandmother has never left Somalia. And my grandmother does not cook. And my mother is not that great of a cook. My mother has 10 children. And so my siblings have always cooked and they've always taken care of the other kids while my mother has gone on to work. And so I think the one shocker to me was how much they enjoyed cooking, because I'm the eldest girl of 10. And so that was odd to me that, these women really enjoyed cooking. Like it was, some places like Madagascar and Mozambique, it was like days on end cooking without a break. And that was a bit of a shock to me in terms of cooking.
Well, I am going to pause my questions and take a few from the audience. And one of the first is actually for Hawa, and that is, why did you choose the 8 nations bordering the Indian Ocean? Was there a commonality that you wanted to explore?
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to focus on making the world smaller. I think that a lot of what I want to do with my career and my life is to examine how food has affected people globally and to really hone in on our similarities and not our differences. I own a line of CPG company, a consumer packaged company called Best Best. It's all based on condiments from the continent of Africa. And for me, talking about the Indian Ocean, focusing on spices, doing it from the perspective of matriarchies made the most sense.
And this question is for Marcus. And actually, I think both of you could probably respond to it. It's, what ingredients do you recommend for a home cook who is just beginning to build a global pantry? What are the building blocks for a good foundation?
I mean, I think we touched on them before, but I think if you look at that space between sort of coriander, cumin, fenugreek, like it's almost like Moroccan spice blend. There's a Moroccan spice blend called El Ras Hanout. That's a great starting point because it's not spicy, but it's so flavorful, right? Almost like a Chinese 5-spice. That's a great one. I think you need to think about oils, different types of oils and different types of vinegars. So it's not just spices, it's also the vinegars and the oils. And then also rethink your rice, your millet, your couscous. Right now you have different ways of really think through a meal, and then your lentils, your chickpeas, and so on, right? If you have that, now you're building an interesting pantry.
And what are your thoughts on that, Hawa?
No, I agree. I mean, I think if you can stock your pantry with a lot of the spices that touch the Indian Ocean, because if you really think about it, it touches the whole globe. There are things that I make every day, like I make a Hawaj mix, which is used in Northern Africa, but is heavily used on the Indian Ocean. Some people would say that it's similar to garam masala. And so, if you're able to make a garam masala or a Hawaj at home, which consists of almost all the same things: cumin, cardamom, cinnamon, cloves, turmeric, and then in the garam masala part, curry powder. If you're able to make that at home, I think that that's a good starting block for building.
And Marcus, one of our viewers is interested to know whether or not you are still involved in Scandinavian cuisine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up in Scandinavia, right? My grandmother, who was an amazing chef, she taught me the reason why I can be a chef today is because of my grandmother Helga. So I still eat herring and enjoy all the Scandinavian breads and so on. So it will always be part of my journey. Making gravlax, making smoked salmon, a lot of the things, my cooking techniques is still based on that. I just, at Rooster, we focus on one thing, and, great things with restaurants is that you can express yourself in different ways. In our Marcus restaurants, and we focus more on the techniques that I learned in Scandinavia.
I mean, both of you are immigrants, fairly recent immigrants to the country. And I am wondering how, as you sort of, Marcus, settled and, focused on Haarlem, how your understanding and your thoughts about what African American cuisine, Black cooking, cooking from the diaspora, how that was defined as you observed the foodways around you.
Right.
Oh, I thought she was asking you. Well, I grew up. Okay, I grew up in Seattle, and when I was about 12 years old or 11 years old, my basketball teammates' parents took me in, and they owned a restaurant from New Orleans that was based on the cuisines of New Orleans. And so I grew up for a few years, not for a long part of my life, because I ended up graduating high school and leaving home. But I grew up washing dishes there. And so I think some of my very first introductions to foodways of African American people were, you know, grits, all sorts of chicken, but mainly fried chicken, you know, collard greens, which I still make till this day. In Bibi's kitchen, there's a collard green in there from Kenya, which is very similar to the collard greens that I grew up with here. My aunt Sheila, who's from Shreveport, Louisiana, even when I go home to Seattle now, I sit at her feet and learn new ways to make grits and shrimp that are some of my favorite things. I regret to say, because I live in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, and I don't go up to Harlem anymore. When I first moved here, I used to go to Melba's all the time. So I'm a little out of pocket right now in terms of being close to the cuisine.
I mean, I think that.
And what was your reaction, Marcus, as you began to explore African American cuisine as it was represented here?
Well, I mean, I think exploring is the best word, right? Because a lot of information in terms of a lot of Black craftsmanship is not right in front of you. You have to actually search and explore. And first of all, I just think that when you think about sort of the four pillars of African American cooking, it links back to Africa, right? When I think about whether it's Southern cooking that we think about as soul food, or low country cooking, or you think about barbecue, or whatever cuisine it is, it follows our journey. You know, it's tied to the migration, it's tied to American history, and just like American history needs to be rewritten and actually write Black people in back factually correct into the history. And we should be proud of all the cuisines in African American cooking. American food wouldn't be the same. It would be very dull without the Black experience. And then it's been built on, because as we marry, as we move around, you know, whether it's through the Caribbean or whether it's going to the West Coast, obviously our cuisine evolves, right? But we should be really proud of our cooking, our Black cooking in America, and it will continue to evolve.
One other question from the audience is back on the shopping for those ingredients. How important is it to shop at cultural grocery stores when preparing your dishes? Or, you know, are most of the ingredients available at sort of mass market stores? Will you be better served going to a more specific grocer?
You know, I'm of the thought of, if there are any obstacles in your way to get to your goal, eliminate them. So if you're starting out, I hate to endorse these bigger grocery chains, but you're gonna find cumin there. You're gonna find cardamom there. You're gonna find, you know, their global aisles are also growing. And I think that a lot of these available grocery store chains are almost trying to eliminate the ethnic aisle, which I don't like saying that word, but they're trying to eliminate it. So don't be afraid to go to your local grocery store and get what you need. And then as you get more familiar with these cuisines, start going to the specialty stores to support them, I would say.
I mean, it's also depending on how much time you have, right? Because if you go to one of our stores or one of our markets, it's a vibe. You know, when I go to my Senegalese guys on 116, it's the vibe. I learn about Afrobeat. I learn about, you know, I hear a blend between Burna Boy and Jusur. You know, for me, it's the vibe. Once you enter this space, it's never just about buying fermented shrimp paste. It's about all of it, right? And, you know, that might be a weekend decision, but if it's a regular day and I'm rushed, sure, I have to go to a bigger grocery store, but, you know, it's such a pleasure to go to an African market. So, you know, it never is about just buying the thing. If you do that, you're missing out. It's about arguing about the price, going back and forth, and they always gonna win. You know you're gonna lose, but you're gonna have a great time.
Well, I loved, Marcus, how you described it as sort of the same way that people, you know, embrace going into, you know, the Jewish deli that someone has told them about, or going to the Italian pasta shop, they get their fresh pasta, that there should be the same kind of enthusiasm for sort of going down the rabbit hole into, you know, the Senegalese market or an Ethiopian market, right?
Yes. I mean, I think about it like I have a decision, like if I want to go and get my hair cut, it's never about getting my hair cut, right? It's really about which barber do I want to catch up with? What do I want to talk sports? Do I want to talk? So there's like my African-American barbershop in Harlem on this side. Then I go to my Senegalese guy. Then we talk about African news, right? Still get the job done, but just very different, diverse conversation. They're both great. They're both in Harlem. They're both local, just different vibes. Same thing when you're shopping for food.
Well, I'm afraid that we are out of time, so I'm going to have to end it there. But I do want to say that please keep enjoying the National Book Festival at loc.gov/bookfest. And I want to thank Marcus and Hawa for joining me today.